And we are live. Good evening,
Excellent.
guys. How are you?
How are you, John?
Good. So, it's such a blessing to have you guys on. But what sort of a day have you had? Have you been out worshiping? Or are you still in lockdown? What kind of a day have you had today so far?
We're relatively in lockdown. I'm busy moving. I'm relocating house to another city,
Oh,
so
wow.
you can see empty shelves behind me and bad lighting, but that's just how it is at the moment. And so we were packing and moving, and that's what we were up to.
Yeah, busy. How about you, Gibble?
Well, thank you for having us, John. And a special shout out to Daniel, who marketed us as world renowned. When my wife heard it, she nearly fell off the bed. So it's the first time in my life I've ever been introduced as world renowned. So thank you, Daniel Gillespie.
Brilliant. But you guys are, and it's great to have you on all the way from South Africa. And I know a lot of the people who know me will know that I've chatted about you guys quite a bit over the past while. You have been such a blessing to us. We had a vision for a long period of time and things that we wanted to implement, and we thought we were going to have to figure it out as we went through the process. But connecting with you guys through a mutual friend, Mark Cashman, over in Oxford, and so you guys have been a blessing to us and really helped us to get all the things that we need to fulfill the vision we already had, which has been an amazing thing. I know we'll chat about that as we go through. But so people are starting to connect in with us. I think we have about approaching 20 on already. So yeah, why don't you guys take a moment or two and just introduce yourselves, a little bit about your background, your family situation, so people can pray for you. And then shortly after that, we're going to hand over to David. He's going to share a story for a few minutes, and then we'll get into the conversation after that. So we'll start with you, Gibbo. Maybe tell us a wee bit about who you are and what you're up to these days.
Thanks, John. Yes, hi to everyone from Pretoria, South Africa, the capital. So I've been in ministry for 30 years, mostly as a pastor, church planter, involved in the mega church environment in the Afrikaans community mostly. I had the honor of planting a church for a while in north of Dublin in the Republic, in Ireland for a while, and that was quite the learning curve. It just happened in a very difficult time, during 2006 to 2008. So 2008, as you know, that was quite difficult. But I learned such a lot. Came back, and in 2010 I met up with David, and he just ruined my life. No, I mean, David will tell you more about himself, and he can then confess. But no, I'm in Pretoria. Like I said, I've been in ministry 30 years. Made a lot of mistakes, learned a lot of things, I hope, and met a lot of fantastic people. I'm married 30 years. I've got 2 children. My one son of 26, a daughter of 24. My daughter is in Vienna. So we miss her a lot. And we're looking forward to this evening.
Yeah. 30 years in marriage. That is a real blessing and such an example too. God bless you for that. Hey, fantastic.
Yeah, my wife needs a medal, So
my wife has took me now for 21 years, so we're well on the way. But and I'm still alive, which is amazing. So
knowing you, it is.
Sorry, go ahead.
Knowing you, it is.
And David, tell us a wee bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for having us on. It's just a privilege over the last year to know you and to grow the relationship. I live in Midrand, South Africa, which is halfway between 2 big cities, Johannesburg and Pretoria, and about an hour's drive from where Gibbo stays. We work together, and I've lived here for 20 years. I'm actually relocating at the moment. So I'm married. My wife is happily married. And I have 2 kids, and they're out of the house. My son has just left the house a couple of weeks ago, And so we are empty nesters officially. And the Lord is relocating us to another city. We're actually doing the opposite of what most people do at this age. We're upscaling. So we're currently in a pretty small place. We're moving into a pretty large place where there'll be offices, and we want to host leaders and work with them there. And so the Lord has really blessed us with that. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. I've been in ministry for 30 years. I keep saying 30 years, but I think I've been saying 30 years for at least the last 5 years. So it's probably more than that. But we've been in ministry for about 30 years and pursuing movements for more than half of that time. So it's just a real privilege to be here on this call. And I see a Jeremy Burke there. If that's the same Jeremy I know, then hi, Jeremy.
Yes. And I was just about to say, Jeremy's in the background. He would be on having the conversation with us tonight, but he's having and I see my camera's having some issues too, but hopefully it'll be okay. But Jeremy, he's just an amazing guy. We love him, and so big shout out to Jeremy. Bless you, man. So, David, you are going to share your story and some of the things that you've experienced as you've stepped into movements and stuff. And then whenever you are finished, we'll come back in and take the conversation a little bit further. So we'll say goodbye for a second, folks, and David will begin to share. So, David, the floor is yours. Inspire us. Bless you.
Excellent. You did say we had 5 hours, right? Yeah, so let me just tell you a little bit about our story. So I was in an area not far from here, building movements of the gospel, and we began to stumble on this probably 25 years ago. And I come from a background of pastoral work and business and missions, and we began to see these small groups multiply in an area called Bophuthatswana, a country called Bophuthatswana that today doesn't exist anymore. And so we began to multiply these groups, but the church we were part of just couldn't understand, couldn't grasp what we were doing. And so we were eventually, the Lord led us to this area, to Midrand. And we came here with this dream of movement. But pretty soon we found ourselves starting a traditional church. And we were several years into that. And I remember the one year, actually the one day, I woke up on a Sunday morning. And I turned to my wife and I said, you know, I'm not sure I want to go to church. I'm not sure I want to go to church this morning. And I didn't know what was going on at that time, but what was really going on is that the Lord was stirring something in me for movements of the gospel. And so we did go to church, and I started preaching, and probably about 100 people in front of me. And in that moment, as I'm busy talking, I go up into the sky. And in my mind, I go up into the sky and I look down on my city. And my city at that stage was 10 million people. So our city is kind of a merging of two cities, Johannesburg and Pretoria, and 10 million people. And I looked down on 10 million people and I asked myself a question I'd never asked before. I asked, what would it take to reach my city? What would it take to significantly impact the lives of 10 million people? And I realized in that moment that I'd been asking a different question. I'd been asking, how can I grow my church? And the Lord had shaped me for something that was different. Most pastors today are asking, how can I grow my church? How can I grow my church? And I think that through some of these crises we've gone through, like Corona, God is shaking the church and he's saying, you need to be asking a different question. And the question at that moment in time that came up in me was, how can I impact the lives of 10 million people? And I realized, and this is all while I'm preaching a sermon, I'm talking to people, but my mind's far away. I'm thinking other thoughts. And I'm asking this question, what would it take to impact the lives of 10 million people? And I realized in that moment that there was nothing wrong with what I was doing. I mean, you know, we started a church, it was growing, it was perfect, it was wonderful. There was nothing wrong with that. However, the trajectory we were on would never be able to impact 10 million people. You couldn't do it. You couldn't build a big building big enough. The model could not handle that kind of growth. And so I went on a pursuit to ask, what would it actually take to impact the lives of 10 million people? We went on a long journey. And soon, it was about 3 years later, we began to see these disciple-making groups emerge, and then churches emerge, and then it began to explode across Southern Africa. And then it began to explode in Eurasia, across 16 different countries. We began to see a movement across there. And then the Lord began to stir something in me a few years later. And we'd seen at that point thousands and thousands of churches start. And we've been partnering with other incredible organizations. And I actually serve on the core team of New Generations, which had also seen incredible explosive growth across Africa. And we began to ask, what would it look like to ask, where's the gospel not moving, and step towards that. And so I came to this transition point where I asked, what do you want me to do, Lord? Where do you want me to go? And I began to search unreached people groups in different places. And as I did that, I came across a statistic on Wikipedia, and it showed urbanization. It showed the growth of cities around the world. And in 2007, that graph showed, was the first time that the world became majority urban. In other words, 2007, most of us didn't realize, but most of the world lived in cities. And that growth just carried on growing, just carried on moving. By 2050, 70% of the world will live in cities. And so it put me on a journey. And we began to ask ourselves, are we seeing these incredible movements of the gospel happen in cities? And we couldn't find anywhere in the world at that point in time that we were seeing these movements in cities. So I went on a journey about 10, 12 years ago, and we began to call together movement leaders and practitioners in different parts of the world and ask them, what would it take to see these movements happen in cities? We did it in Russia, we did it in London, we did it in Dallas, Texas, we did it in Africa, we did it in Asia, we did it in India, we did it in all these different places. And slowly different answers began to emerge, and a methodology I'd say methodology, a set of principles for what it would take to see movements of the gospel happen in cities began to emerge. And so we began to train different people and train different teams, and slowly we began to see success. And right now, last year, inside of coronavirus, we launched an equipping program for teams in cities to see these movements of the gospel happen. So that's pretty much the journey that we've been on. And just so excited to be serving teams that want to see the gospel move and multiply from person to person to person. Leaders multiply, churches multiply, disciples multiply in different cities around the world. John?
Yeah, we're coming back in now. So yeah, and I know that as I have chatted with you guys about some of the things that you've experienced, we have been just blessed and inspired and stirred, and we've just really enjoyed the journey with you guys so far, and we're looking forward to the rest. And so a lot of people have a lot of questions about the whole concept of movement in the Western world. A lot of people have they have a long experience, if you like, of typical Western church type context, and that has been such a blessing to so many, including myself. But if we really want to see cities, nations impacted, and communities transformed, not just buildings and all of that, there needs a slightly different approach. And this is what you guys are so committed to and passionate about. But between you guys, could you maybe explain the key difference even between the typical Western church programmed type gathering, which is the central part of the experience, the difference between that and the whole concept of multiplying movement? What are the differences?
I'll set it up, John, with this question. The question we wrestle with will give the answer. I remember when I started interacting with David, he had such fun with me in 2010. He always answered a question with a question or with a testimony. He was discipled by David Watson. If you want to Google David L. Watson, I mean, what an amazing guy. And David had the privilege of being mentored by David Watson, a guy that saw tremendous church growth explosions in Asia and in Africa. So the question we always wrestle with is, what will it take to see movements of the gospel, movements of ordinary people? And there should be already an answer there for you. Ordinary people, movements of these people through multiple generations, movements which we don't have to control or own.
Yeah.
So the Holy Spirit's just running through people with the living word. So that's the question we wrestle with. So it has to do with quite a lot of things, but central to that would be the ordinary person and the mobilization of every believer.
Yeah, I'd say there's a whole bunch of principles, John, but I have a lot of pastoral friends. I come from a ministry background. I have friends that have studied at seminary and Bible college with me, and I sit with a lot of pastors, a lot of leaders, both Gibber and I do. Leaders of very, very large churches, small churches. We love them. We love the church. We love the pastors. But we sit with them behind closed doors, and they describe the same crisis that I had when I was running a more traditional model of church. And let me describe the crisis I had. Let me not put words in their mouth, but let me describe the crisis I had. I would spend all week preparing for a sermon. And I would get to a Saturday, and usually I've left some things late. So Saturday night, I'm sort of putting the finishing touches on it. Sunday morning, I get there and I pour out my heart to this congregation. I mean, I'm preaching with all the fire and brimstone I can manage to drum up. and then I get to Monday morning, and I would hit every week. I would hit the Monday blues. I would get very, very depressed. And you say, why would you get depressed? Because I knew that all that work, all that effort, everything that I gave would have very little impact. Very few people would remember what I said, would go out and do something about it. And so what we saw was a sterilization of the gospel. We would see it just kind of contained inside of this church, and people would love each other. They were great people, fantastic people, but we wouldn't see the gospel move towards brokenness and lostness. And that frustrated me. And when you make an attempt, we'd go out and do a crusade somewhere. And then, what I call a bait and switch strategy. So we would do this exciting crusade. We'd bait everybody, get everybody saved, and then we'd switch on them and say, this atmosphere that you gave your life to Jesus in, that atmosphere is going away. You now need to go to church. And the environment in church wasn't what they experienced in that crusade. So we'd lose most of them. And I mean, we built a big truck. We called it the gospel truck. We did crusades all over Africa. So I really, from experience, know what I'm talking about. We would have thousands of hands raised, and then you'd go back, a week later, and you couldn't find anybody. So really that frustration grew in me. This understanding that I was sitting in something that I love, that I cherish, that I believe in, and yet was not having the impact on society, on my city that I so desperately needed. And I'm finding as we speak to pastors and people that we know and new leaders that we meet, behind closed doors, they have the same frustration. They're desperately wanting to see their people mobilized. We give lip service to the priesthood of every believer, but we don't really practice it. And so, I don't think that movements are a radical shift in theology. I think that they're just bringing us back to what we actually claim we believe in the first place.
Yeah. Love that. And I love the refocus, if you like, on a doctrine that we all believe, the priesthood of all believers. And so that begins in a typical church context, that begins to get difficult. For some leaders, they're afraid to release people in case all of the wrong things happen and all of that. But it's just trusting people, knowing that you have sowed into them in a beautiful way. And so as you move through the process, and so I love the term that you use, disciple making movements, DMM, and it begins with making disciples and helping people to step into obedience. How do movements like that begin? In the most simple terms, how does that begin? Maybe people watching are thinking, well, that sounds something I would love to be a part of. How does this begin?
I think from my side, you can't engineer movement. You can't push a button, pull a lever, turn a switch, and say, now I have a move of God. There's no ways you can do that. So they do begin with God. The good news is that God makes it clear in His heart, in His scriptures, that in His heart is this desire for all men to get to know Him. So movement is in His heart, but it begins with Him. So it begins with finding out where God is already at work and joining him in that work from the beginning. But I think that one of the ways that God is always at work, and through scripture, whenever God was about to do something, he was raising up a person. There was a person that he was raising up every single time. And so it's a matter of, is this burning in your heart? Is this idea of how does my city, how does my area, how does my community, how does my village hear the gospel? Not just the church, but how does this village hear the gospel? If that's burning in your heart, then I think it's falling on your knees and saying, God, am I that person? Am I that person that are you stirring something in me for this group of people? Maybe it's not a physical locality like a village or a city. Maybe it's business people, or maybe it's young people, or maybe it's ladies or divorced people in your area. I don't know. But is this burning in my heart? I think movements are firstly a work of God, and secondly, God raises up a person, and it's usually in prayer that he raises that up. You can't engineer it. And one of my concerns is there is a lot of movement talk around the world today, and some of it almost comes across like push this button, switch the switch, do these 5 steps and you have movement. I think it's birthed in the spirit, it's birthed in prayer.
Yeah, I love that. Is born of God overcomes the world. And it's that birthing process that's the most exciting thing. And I do have a sense that, and I'm not claiming any ownership of any of this, but I do have a sense that God is birthing some stuff in Ireland at the minute. I do believe that right across the board in so many different groupings and families of the gospel, that people are just beginning to open up to a new thing, to a new fresh expression of church. And that's very, very exciting. I'm going to try not to jump up and down in the seat as I think about it, but something very real is birthing. And it's such an exciting thing to begin to see those wee ambers just beginning to ignite. And yeah, so we want to really fan that flame and see what God is up to. And so how big, something I know that we've talked about quite a bit, guys, and as we move forward with the Great Commission and everything else, and as disciples are made and it becomes contagious and disciples begin to multiply, how important is it to have things like obedience and learning to obey Jesus and walk in the power of the Spirit? How important is those things to be at the very center of this as it's birthed?
Well, Jesus said, if you love me, he said very clearly, you will obey my commandments. And we see in movements that often people, are knowledge rich, but their obedience poor. And in the West, we struggle with the word obedience. Sometimes we have to contextualize it when we train westernized people or people from the West, and we have to say we cooperate with God or we co-labor, but it still comes down to the heart condition. I think one of the most fundamental truths in life is He's God and you're not. It's as simple as that. And we need to really bow our hearts before Him and understand who the Almighty is. And without that understanding, we'll struggle. No, it is called movements, replicative viral movements have an obedience component at its core, very, very much so. It also has another component which we call personal discovery. If the middleman comes in, the religious middleman, often, it negates the self-discovery of truth, the self-discovery, this personal priesthood that you have. You can go into the Holy of Holies yourself. I don't want someone to go through, in a sense. I can go there myself. I don't need a middleman. What I'm trying to say by that is that if you discover something, you own it. You really, really own it. And then, of course, the third thing we always say, not just obedience, not just personal discovery, but also how do we replicate? How do we multiply? How do we move forward? So obedience is central.
Yeah. I love it. And to see people, we're in contact with a few. You mentioned that word discovery. So we have some discovery groups at the moment. And some of these guys are very new to the faith. Some are exploring faith. but there's just this passion to obey Jesus, and it's so refreshing. And really, that should be the norm for all of us, shouldn't it? But to see these guys just going through this process and learning to apply the word to their lives every week, and chat through that maybe the week later on the specific thing that we've chatted about, it's just such a beautiful, beautiful thing. And so I want to open the conversation out a little bit. When we begin to think of movements, and I know you guys love to bounce off each other in these things, and so what do you think are the key principles, the really important central principles for movements as they birth and as they grow and begin to multiply? What are the key central things?
Well, we have a list of about 12 key principles, which is too long to go through here. But let me touch on one or two of them. I think, for us, number one, abiding fruitfulness is there. So Jesus touches on that in John 15. If you abide in me, you'll bear much fruit. And so, abiding fruitfulness, which is obviously, prayer. And so as a key movement leader, if someone wants to catalyze movements, if you're not on your knees before the Lord, then it's not going to happen. Again, you can't engineer it. A second principle for us is, and I'll just touch on one or two or three of them, but God at work. I call it the Henry Blackaby principle. He actually made the principle famous, didn't come up with it for the first time. But he said God is at work, and it's our job to join him in his work. So often we treat the work of God as something that happens because we're in the room. The man for the hour where the power has arrived. And so because I've walked into the room, things happen. And when I leave the room, things stop happening. When I reached the city, things started happening. When we moved to this city, the first thing we did was go and meet all the different leaders, host them for breakfast, and say, what is God already doing in this city? Because he's at work. He's at work when you meet somebody for the first time. He's already at work in that person. And so they don't first sort of, step into God's presence because you're in the room. He's already been at work. So asking yourself, what is God already doing in every situation, and how can I join in that work? And then, I think it's very important. Just the third one, and I'll stop there. But the third one that we talk about is the principle of natural social networks. We have become so used to sort of a broadcast style of getting the gospel across. We want to tie it down in a perfect 3-point sermon and broadcast it, and have nobody challenge it or nobody talk back. We'll just kind of say it and then hope that some of it lands in the right place. But Jesus has a very different style of teaching. Like Gibbo said, he kind of asks questions, he tells stories. Sometimes he goes, I'm not going to tell you what this means, and walks away, because he uses this discovery mode, and he very clearly follows a principle of natural social networks. So movements are very different to our broadcast style of doing church. They travel through the same lines that good news, bad news, and fake news travels through. And that is natural relationships, natural social networks. So this person knows that one knows that one. This one brings 2 brothers to Jesus. This lady brings a whole town to Jesus because, he told her things that, nobody else could have known. And so Jesus follows through these natural social networks. We've got to get back to that. And I think personally that crises like Corona have, I wouldn't say God engineered them, God caused them, but in the middle of that, I think God is taking the church back to that and saying, you've got to get out of this broadcast mentality and get back to a relational mentality and say, ask yourself, what do these relational networks look like? And how does the gospel move? It moves the same channels that good news, bad news, and fake news moves through. The gospel moves through those same channels. What does it look like? My whole city, today it's 15 million people. My whole city is networked in some way. Everybody knows somebody, and through those networks, the gospel wants to move. That means it's got to be the ordinary people that carry the gospel into those places that I would never be. So what does it look like for the word of God, the living word of God, to move through people, for the Spirit of God to move through people into my city, to bring redemption to those spaces in the city? That's really what movements are about. So, in a nutshell, 3 principles.
Yeah.
Can I add another 3 on top of that? Just a different angle. Like David said, what will it take for the Spirit to move? And he always puts it so beautifully. In movements, we need 3 things to move. Now, firstly, even in the Bible, in Genesis, right in the beginning, what was the first person that moved was the Spirit. So the Spirit needs to move, right? Secondly, the living Word, the Bible, needs to move. The Word of God needs to move. So that's the incarnated Word. It's our obedience life. It's our faithfulness and obedience in living out, manifesting, modeling Jesus. So the Spirit moves, the living Word moves, and then the people of God also need to move. So that's another way of looking at it. Those 3 things we need for movement.
Yeah. And what I love about this whole concept is, and please I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. I love the big celebrations where we worship together, and whether it's 50 people or 1,000 people, I love that. I think it's really, really important to come together as the body and to celebrate all that God is doing and all of that. But I've grown probably to love even more those gatherings around the kitchen table where we just open the Word and we discuss it and we discover and we laugh, we carry on, and God is as much, sometimes maybe more so, in those things as in any of the other things, and there's that accountability around the table. There's that sense of family, oikos, and just coming together as friends, as brothers and sisters, discovering the Word together and stepping into the fullness of it. And there's something really precious about that, and so we're probably coming near the end of our stream, but just to fire it out, are there any really key things that you feel in your heart that you want to share for people in Ireland as they watch now or later? Are there any really key things about the whole concept of movement that you want to share?
No, I mean, here's the key, John. God is doing something. He really is doing something around the world at the moment, and it's pretty remarkable. And I'm excited to be living in this time where we're in between. I grew up in the 80s in churches and big celebrations, and I loved that, and I still love that, and I still enjoy that. And yet the world is shifting, and God is doing something right now that's really amazing. One of the pastors that I work with in Kansas City, we helped him and get into movement, and he was leading a large church, very innovative, very creative large church, and he hooked up with us and began to build movements of the gospel. And one day I asked him why, and he said, David, I spent 20-30 years building this church, and I love it. This is my heart and soul and passion, but I just realized that it would take me another 30 years to plant another one church. And that will never get the job done. And so as much as I love it, as much as this is incredible, it's just not adequate to get the job done. We've got to start with, when we design strategy, we've got to start with the problem and work backwards, not with ourselves. And too many people say, well, how can I make this thing bigger? Versus what is the problem and how can we actually solve the problem? The problem is that vast numbers of people are not getting access to the gospel. On the doorsteps of many of our churches, they're not getting access to the gospel because something is broken. And it's not a criticism on the whole church or the whole church model, but something's broken. And we really need to be thinking and asking the Lord, what is it that you want to do in this moment in time? I think the Spirit of God is stepping into churches and he's beginning to bring a shift. And there's even external forces that are bringing a shift and taking the church out of what I call our safe, holy spaces into spaces in the city of brokenness and lostness. And God is doing that. God is causing that shaking. And it's really exciting because it's in those spaces that we really see the kingdom.
John, I get so excited when I think about Jim Collins that said sometimes the good can be the enemy of the best.
Yeah.
And God has always got more in mind. We've certainly learned a lot, but we're by no means, how can I say, we're always learning, and we're standing on the shoulders of people who've come before us, and it's such a learning journey. But it's so important to realize that we've got to understand the principles You know, I've been a Bible college dean. I've got a long history. I've hit the wall many times, as I call in organized religion. God is certainly on the work, and part of that work is understanding the principles of multiplicative strategies. You know, we always joke in movement teaching, and we say Christians are not good at spiritual arithmetic. We don't do that well. We can add a bit, you know, can do the plus sign. We can subtract. Heck, sometimes we can really divide well. But do we really know how to multiply? And may God help us to really learn how to multiply, how to be replicative. May the Spirit work. And because it's going to take nothing less than viral movements, vast movements, to get the Great Commission done.
Yeah. And so I know that we have loved this journey with you guys so far. Really looking forward to the next stages of that and all that God's up to with us. And we thank you so much for all the input and the heart that you have to help in any way to see movement sparked and all of that. And so I guess for everyone listening, you know, I was chatting in a church this morning, and we were just speaking on Joshua chapter 1, and those guys were just presented with this new normal. And the only thing really that they were required to do was just to say, yep, Lord, we'll do whatever you ask and we'll go wherever you send us. And whenever we have that heart that's open, God will do his thing. But he loves us to really step into biblical principles of how he wants to reach a community. And so it's finding where he's at, I suppose, and just crying out to get partnered with him in what he's already doing. And so I hope and pray that we can go on the journey with you guys. And we're so grateful for people like yourselves who just sow themselves into whatever God's doing and wherever he's doing it. And I believe guys like you are a gift to the body. And yeah, so Claire, a good friend, who you will meet soon, she says, may God teach us to multiply. And that is just so simple and so central to everything that we want to see God do. And so, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. Thank you for the friendship, the relationship, the input. And we look forward to seeing all that God has to do. So if people have a heart to find out more about movements, David has a website, David Broderick. What's the website, David?
John, I have the privilege of saying Google me, because I think I come up number 1 or number 2. And I don't think it's because I'm famous. It's just because my name is unique. So it's just but it's davidbroderick.org.
No problem. And my name's John, so there's billions of us. Every time we enter a room and somebody says John, everyone looks around. It's interesting. But guys, thank you so much for coming on. And I have no doubt that when this is all over, we're definitely going to have to get you over to Ireland, and we will go through that journey. So thank you so much again. And so thank you everybody for connecting in. As usual, get in touch with us if you want to find out more about this topic. If you want to step into a discovery group or maybe begin a discovery group in your home or whatever, we want to help you. We want to see God birth things in every street, every community. We want that river of Ezekiel to lap against every doorstep. And so please do get in touch with us, and we'll do everything we can. We'll give ourselves to helping you in any way that we can. So God bless you, and we will speak again soon. Good night. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.